we once again risk controversy. We once again risk becoming pariahs in for the reason of finding truth in the world. And I mean, so be it. Like, I'm not setting out here to be controversial. I'm setting out here to strengthen the philosophy of liberty. And that requires pointing out when we find problems. That's not to say I completely disagree with Rothbard. Oh no, we have much that we agree on. Once again, we're going to be critiquing a natural law philosophy.
Part 4 deals with the most important modern theories which attempt to establish a political philosophy of liberty, in particular those of Mises, Hayek, Berlin, and Nozick. I do not attempt to review their works in detail, but rather to concentrate on why I think their theories fail at the task of establishing an ideology of liberty.
I would just like to point out that what he does in the last part of this book is exactly what we're doing here with his work today. And when I talk, I've said this so many times, but I'm going to take this moment to highlight it. This is how and why libertarian philosophy has come so far and so fast. It's because we do this. We honor each other by critiquing their work and criticizing it when we think they get it wrong in respectful, constructive ways. So please take this stream in the same light that Rothbard is going to be taking these other libertarian theories at the end of this book. I don't agree that the human species has no nature, but I think we need to define nature better, and I'll wait and let Rothbard do that. So my position is not that man has no nature. My position is that to state what man's nature is, you have to collectivize all humans. And there's going to be a spectrum and a margin of error, because not all members of the human species will match your whatever definition of nature you come up with. There will be exceptions. The only way you can glean a nature from something would be to analyze a specific individual and say, maybe I can kind of analyze what Patrick Smith's nature is. And even then, you would still be projecting your opinions onto what my nature is. But we're going to have plenty of time to get into what I mean by that. Christian, do you have anything you want to say?
I think I can cover this a bit more further, but I typically hold the position that quote unquote man has no nature. And I think we can go more into this later, but it has to do a lot with like how you determine what a nature is. And there's usually some kind of value judgment involved in that. And if you've ever heard me talk before, I'm not a big fan of value judgments being included in statements of objectivity. So
just as even God cannot cause that 2 times 2 should not make 4, so he cannot cause that which is intrinsically evil be not evil. Well, that's an interesting assertion
yeah.
God's power is limited. There went omniscience. And you also bring in the Euthyphro dilemma, which is not on topic for today, so we'll leave that alone. I wanted to back up and talk about this little bit right here. What we have been saying would have a degree of validity, even if we should concede that which cannot be conceded without the utmost wickedness, that there is no God. So this brings up an important thing that we have to think about, the biases inherent in these philosophers. Now, while there's a lot of them that tried to create a moral philosophy and a string of logic that didn't require God, they still have an internal bias that would prevent them from exploring philosophies that include or depend on the utmost wickedness, that include that which cannot be conceded. And so when we read a lot of these philosophers that were religious, that were deists at least, the works that they created always had to leave room for that, because that was an internal wall that they couldn't get around. But we have our first definition of what natural law is: a body of rules which man is able to discover by the use of his reason. So a body of rules discoverable, which imply that they exist sort of outside the mind.
And these are specifically normative rules. Not necessarily, I mean, well, just based off of this definition alone, this author might have included things like, electromagnetism could be like a natural law just from that interpretation. But at least in the context of this work, I think it's fair to say that these are going to be normative, discoverable laws, right?
Otherwise, I don't think we'd be critiquing it, because it would just be opinion. If they weren't asserting normative objective laws, we probably wouldn't be here. in the Thomistic tradition, natural law is ethical as well as physical law. Yep.
Sorry, yeah, that was a point of clarification though. But yeah, so like I was saying earlier, it is both the normative and physical aspects of it. So
it is the possession of reason which distinguishes man from the animals, and which, quote, enables him to act deliberately in view of the consciously apprehended end and raises him above the level of purely instinctive behavior.
So basically, this part is essentially from the animals could be construed as what we talk about in the state of nature, right? So it's this idea of an amoral, aethical existence where there are no deontological limitations on any of your actions, which means like there's no rule or hand of God which is going to come in, or constitution which will swoop in and stop you from doing the bad things, right? So this idea of rationality, which separates human people from animals, is also kind of the idea that it's related to the idea that separates the person with the capacity to engage in consensual relations and everything else in the state of nature that can't or won't or chooses not to. So that I think to me is like the big comparison that I see there.
And to nitpick, because I can't not do it because my brain, while the distinction of capacity to reason between human and animal is practically true, it's logically arbitrary. So I usually don't say human and animal. I usually just talk about the entities with the capacity to conceptualize, like advanced conceptualization, the entities that are able to understand concepts like rights and modify their behavior according to those conceptions.
It also allows for humans to be classified as state of nature beings, which under this consideration you couldn't really do, which raises problems for ethical, we'll say, punishments, perhaps, which this work gets into. So I'd be a little interested to see how he addresses that.
That's a good point. I sell my pedanticness short. You're right in that regard, because certainly some humans fall outside of the set of beings that can conceptualize or that choose to reciprocate rights. There is therefore room for the concept of right reason, reason directing man's acts to the attainment of the objective good for man. Moral conduct is therefore conduct in accord with right reason. If it is said that moral conduct is rational conduct, what is meant is that it is conduct in accordance with right reason, reason apprehending the objective good for man and dictating the means to its attainment. I think we have located a crux of disagreement in this paragraph for sure. Aquinas then realized that men always act purposively, but also went beyond this to argue that ends can also be apprehended by reason as either objectively good or bad for man. Ends can be apprehended by reason as either objectively good or bad for man.
And this is so the man part. At first, I thought it was like a singular man, but then we talk about this idea of the objective good for man as like a greater mankind, and that's, I think, where you really start to lose it, because there's like an argument you could make of like what is objective based on your subjective preferences, right? But that's a nothing burger of an argument. That's not what they're trying to say. They're framing this off of the good for mankind, which is like a way bigger claim.
They're taking on a burden of proof, at least. Maybe they'll satisfy it. We'll see. There is therefore room for the concept of right reason. So right reason would be reason directing man's acts to the attainment of the objective good for man. So this idea of an objective good for the human species. This is when I see man, that's kind of what I translate it to in my head. Moral conduct is therefore conduct in accord with right reason. If it is said that moral conduct is rational conduct, what is meant is that it is conduct in accordance with right reason. Reason apprehending the objective good for man and dictating the means to its attainment. So it's really all in this one sentence that was up here. Like, ends can be apprehended by reason as either objectively good or bad for man. So we're collectivizing human species into man. We are deciding, or we are hopefully gleaning from nature. Hopefully they'll prove that what objective good action is for the human species. Because the objective part isn't actually the problem with the sentence. It's like the definitions of where do we get the good or bad evaluation from, and does that really actually apply objectively to every member of the human species? Like, this is your problem right here.
Good and bad are meaningless statements at this point or meaningless terms at this point in the conversation because they haven't been defined. So it's like you say good or bad, and we have to just like put our own interpretations on them at this point.
In natural law philosophy, reason is not bound, as it is in modern post-Humean philosophy, to be a mere slave to the passions, confined to cranking out the discovery of the means to arbitrarily chosen ends. For the ends themselves are selected by the use of reason.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest, most important parts of this entire work, is that reason is segmented up into two categories. And that is reason, which you may colloquially think of it, of like your brain figuring up ways to solve a problem or put together reality or something like that. And then right reason, which is specifically being moral reasoning, good moral reasoning, correct moral reasoning. And that idea of right reason is asserted now, and hopefully will be substantiated a bit more later. But we'll be doing the majority of the heavy lifting for this, because if we can demonstrate right reason as some kind of instrument that not only is not just an arbitrary, meaningless categorization to try to, create a variable which justifies the proof, but is something which is discoverable in and of itself, we have something we can work with here. But that is a big claim to make, because Hume's claim is essentially that reason is just the first tool, and it can be used for things that we perceive to be morally good or bad, but it doesn't make it any different than reason as reason.
I see reason as a computer processor that functions, if properly used, it functions objectively and deterministically, and you can point that processor at processing whatever equation you want, and if you plug in a poor, well, I shouldn't say it like that. If you plug in one moral equation, it's going to execute that formulation. And choosing what moral formulation that you plug into that processor is necessarily subjective. Provably so, it would seem. But I think, well, we'll see. The general law of morality for man is a special case of the system of natural law governing all entities of the world, each with its own nature and its own ends. Okay, so this is saying that like each species, I guess, would have its own nature and its own ends. But even that is an arbitrary distinction. It takes a mind looking at the world and all of the species out there and drawing lines between all the species. Those lines that you draw between species are not part of reality. Those are lines that we've drawn, or that we project onto reality. So you have to be careful with this stuff. And that goes back to like teleology. There's extrinsic and intrinsic teleology. The idea that there's intrinsic purpose to things, I think, is a burden of proof that I've never seen sufficient evidence for. Extrinsic teleology is pretty much all we have. It's us projecting purpose onto things and drawing distinctions between categories. Like, these things don't exist in reality. It's us projecting them onto things. And here we come to a vital difference between inanimate or even non-human living creatures and man himself. For the former are compelled to proceed in accordance with the ends dictated by their natures, let's say DNA, whereas man, quote, the rational animal, possesses reason to discover such ends and the free will to choose. I find that man's rational capacity is on a very big spectrum that includes none.
Yes.
And yes, does not include perfect. I don't know anybody that is perfectly rational. I don't think such a human has ever existed. But I do know humans that can't rationalize much of anything. So you have to be careful when you're collectivizing and drawing these distinctions around the human species.
We talked about rationality as a process. Even a human who is always perfectly rational process-wise requires perfect information coming in to always have perfect outcomes, because the process can be perfect, but if the inputs aren't, then you're going to get garbage outputs. And that's something important to keep in mind as well. Like there's a lot of things that have to go right as far as we know now for all of these things to be airtight.
Even if this right reason existed, and even if the good and bad was an objective thing in reality, your right reason could still be fed bad data, which would result in wrong action.
Yeah, unless we're going to try to claim that right reason always only leads to correct outcomes, which, yeah, I mean, now we're talking about something more than a process. We're talking about, like, I don't want to go back to the whole theology thing he was claiming, a lot of this is grounded in, but it would be basically like a divination almost at that point, more than it would rationality as a process.
And then it says, but it cannot tell him that he ought to act rationally, or that acting irrationally is acting badly or basely. I'm not sure. I think we can make a case that reason can tell us we ought to act rationally, because if we base our reason on, for example, the laws of logic that are extracted from the consistency of the universe, an argument can be made built on that acting inconsistency with the universe will probably will give you better outcomes, or will give you outcomes that are more likely to be successful than if you're trying to do things that contradict the consistency of the universe. It would be like rationality would tell you, stop trying to cast magic spells. That doesn't work in this universe.
Yeah, I think this might be a good time for me to bring up one of my grievances with like simplifying reason down to like an instanced phenomenon, because I don't really think it's productive to think about it that way at all. I think of reason as like a layer of processes that are all going on, and you can have flaws in any one of these layers, but like orienting yourself to reality could be like one layer of reason that you have that therefore dictates all of the other reason that goes on in your other bubbles that you have. And so looking at it as like a monolithic process, which is all just structured and instanced and kind of like gets switched on and off or something, I don't think is productive for better understanding how humans actually interact with the world and process information and stuff like that.
I will say I appreciate the attempt at being objective with moral philosophy. Like, a lot of people want to treat philosophy as not a science and not subordinate to the rigor that other sciences are. So I appreciate this and aspire to this. Yeah. Right.
An apple let fall will drop to the ground. This we all observe and acknowledge to be in the nature of the apple, as well as the world in general. That's a highlightable thing right there, because I think he may.
I was already on it.
Yeah. 2 atoms of hydrogen combined with 1 of oxygen will yield 1 molecule of water. Behavior that is uniquely in the nature of hydrogen, oxygen, and water. Okay. There is nothing arcane or mystical about such observations. Why then cavil at the concept of nature? The world, in fact, consists of a myriad number of observable things or entities. This is surely an observable fact, since the world does not consist of one homogeneous thing or entity alone. It follows that each one of these different things possesses different attributes. Otherwise, they would all be the same thing. But if A, B, C, etc. have different attributes, it follows immediately that they have different natures. So, this might be a good time to pause to say, and maybe he'll clarify and make this a bit brighter earlier. He's literally describing nature as the set of possible things a thing can do. That is what's happening right now. The
mechanically,
apple can fall.
Deterministically.
Yeah. The apple can fall. The H2O and oxygen can become water. These are in these things' natures, the allowable limits of the universe, essentially.
I want to point out the subjective line drawing going on here with the apple example, for example. An apple let fall will drop to the ground. This we all observe and acknowledge to be in the nature of the apple. Well, you've decided to draw a line around the apple and associate the nature to the apple. Why didn't you draw a line around the force of gravity and the gravitational constant and say, well, it's the nature of gravity to pull apples towards objects with larger mass. Like, this is an arbitrary sort of like circling out of things and saying, and nouning them, applying a noun called nature to the mechanics of reality. And if that's all nature is just the mechanics of reality, then I think he's going to have a lot of problems later in turning that into a moral philosophy, but we'll get there, I'm sure. And he says, but if A, B, and C, etc. have different attributes, it follows immediately that they have different natures. Okay, well, every single human alive and that has ever lived has had different attributes from all of the other individuals. There has never been two humans, well, except for maybe like, what is the twins? You know, with the exact Siamese same DNA twins? Or something, Siamese twins or something like that, with the same DNA, with all the same attributes. Even if they have the same DNA, the differences in nurturing from birth turn into different unique humans. So it then follows immediately that you need to stop collectivizing all humans and applying a single nature to them that you can then extract a moral philosophy from. These are all different individuals. They all have different natures.
Yeah, I think his idea of things or entities metaphysically is doing a lot of work here, where he's able to create these groups, these categories that can function, because all apples can fall to gravity, right? We wouldn't say that some apples could and some apples couldn't, therefore it is in the nature of the apple. But I completely agree. I don't even think a Siamese twin, there has not been a single human that would have the same nature under this idea as another, ever. There probably will never be, just because of the sheer variety that is possible through genetics and nurture, etc. The observable behavior of each of these entities is the law of their natures, and this law includes what happens as a result of the interactions. The complex that we may build up of these laws may be termed the structure of natural law. What is mystical about that? The observable behavior of each of these entities. Okay, so that's what we were talking about before.
So observable behaviors equals the nature of an entity.
Yeah. The apple falls, the atoms combined into molecules, etc.
Yeah. This is gonna be one that we're gonna beat him over the head with later, though. So like, that's why I highlighted
setting
it.
a really high bar. Really high bar there. It doesn't seem like it would be a high bar. It seems like, we can just look at it. But it's a very high bar, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. Applied to man, however, the concept is far more controversial. And yet, if apples and stones and roses each have their specific natures, is man the only entity, the only being that cannot have one? And if man does have a nature, why cannot it too be open to rational observation and reflection?
I don't want to make an accusation that we're using multiple definitions of nature as we proceed, and we're going to jump between them, because I guess I can't reference that yet. I just feel it coming. Like, if observable behavior is something's nature, then according to that definition, no one would say that a person doesn't have a nature, because they have observable behavior. Every object in the universe has observable interactions with the rest of nature. And again, another thing that just bubbled up in my mind about the drawing lines around things to make them into categories, whatever, is that, remember, everything in the universe is nothing more than quantum particles that collapse waveforms in a big quantum soup that bubbles up into larger larger molecules, let's say, larger atoms than molecules, and then systems called bodies, and then you have all of these are just drawing subjective lines around this quantum soup that is reality. I just wanted to kind of go back to point out another way in which we're drawing lines about reality, around reality.
Can I be a bit pedantic and / or myopic for just a moment?
And this is more Disenthrall's about, man.
I've never, I haven't. First time I went through this, I don't even know if I caught anything. So I'm going to throw it out there and see what you think about it. But so this idea that we're building this observational nature, right? The apple falls, that apple falls, this apple fell, the apple over there fell. Cool, apples fall. That's in their nature. If we're going off of this observable thing that's happening, is it not also fair to say that not all apples fall the same? So if they have a different weight, it may be in their nature to fall faster than another apple. if we're just going off of, without making any further unnecessary arbitrary delineations, there is discrete differences between the natures of these things that will impact what the nature exactly is.
Yeah, and also the context of where they exist. Like, an apple doesn't fall if it's in space.
Right. So we can say an apple that is exactly like this apple has the nature to fall exactly like this. But then we're not talking about natures anymore. We're not using nature as a category, which is the function of nature here, is to provide a category, a set of possible things that something can do in reality. We're now just talking about instanced phenomenon, like everything else.
Yeah, the clearest definition that he made is just like the mechanical interactions of how things work in reality. Okay. Like, if that's the definition, then that's really clear, and we can agree on that. But I feel like he's going to start to use it in more, I don't want to say woo ways, but, he's going to abstract it heavily.
One common flip criticism by opponents of natural law is who is to establish the alleged truths about man? Great question, actually. Yeah. The answer is not who, but what. Man's reason. Man's reason is objective, i.e., it can be employed by all men to yield truths about the world. To ask what is man's nature is to invite the answer. Go thou and study and find out.
Man's reason establishes the alleged truth about man. Okay, which man's reason? But then he says, it doesn't matter which man, because man's reason is objective. It can be employed by all men to yield truth about the world. Really? So all men have equal capacities to reason? All men that even if we take the subset of humans that can reason really well, you think they're all going to reach the same conclusions? Really?
And this is where I get back to like us. I'm curious if we're talking about reason as a process at all, because reason as a process being objective entails some kind of infallibility to it, including in like the incorrect inputs situation. Like if you, but this maybe comes back to the right reason. It's like, you weren't doing the right reason. The right reason is objective. Reason is objective in that sense.
Also, it just goes back to the collectivizing the entire species thing. Like, I think I would have trouble analyzing you, Christian, and coming up with objective, nature, an objective nature of Christian, a single individual. I think that would be really challenging because it probably changes from moment to moment. Like the Christian from 5 years ago would probably have a different nature than the Christian of now. So that means it's constantly in flux. And what I mean by that is like using this definition of nature as a mechanical description of how you interact with the world. The nature of Christian 5 years ago would have interacted with the world differently than he does today. He would have had a different nature. And so if I can't even do it for one person, how could you possibly do it for all of man? It just seems far-fetched in the extreme. So another common charge is that natural law theorists differ among themselves and that therefore it should be discarded. Well, when you're saying things like man's reason is objective and then two different natural law theorists provide two different conclusions, it illustrates subjectivity in man's so-called objective reason, which is called a contradiction, which is a problem. Go ahead.
I think what it does, which I think maybe I hope he would understand this, is that what the criticism does is illustrate that there's like something else that needs to be demonstrated other than saying, look, this is my natural law. This is okay. Well, this other guy has his natural law and it says something completely different. So one of you two has to be wrong at least. Why is it not you? That's the charge that's actually being placed. I don't think it's so much. I think some people are probably just skipping that step because they either may assume that they can't prove it or whatever. But the actual charge is, why are you not the one who's wrong? Or why are you right, rather, to get rid of the double negative.
I think I'm also trying to make sure that I'm not being too myopic because look, and this upsets me, right? The man isn't around anymore. Otherwise, he would have had an invitation to be on the show with us right now, as is my rule. So we are critiquing his work that he is not around to defend. So I need to remember to be charitable I don't think that he thinks man's reason is perfect. So I need to make sure I don't hold him to that standard. But it is a logical contradiction to say that man's reason is objective and that all men can employ it to glean truths about the world and then to have natural law adherents come up with different truths about the world.
The natural law ethic decrees that for all living things, so he's saying it's an assertion. I mean, that's the only thing I can take from decree. Goodness, what is good, is the fulfillment of what is the best for that type of creature. We need a definition of best. Goodness is therefore relative to the nature of the creature concerned. Best is doing a lot of work there.
No, I think this is the missing cornerstone of natural law philosophy that we've just hit. This is the speed bump. This is the speed bump. This is the fundamental problem that's missing. So maybe we belabor this point for a moment. The judgment of what is best in relation to... See, even the type of creature is a collectivizing of a bunch of individuals that will have slightly different natures. So even if we band-aid that and say the fulfillment of what is best for a specific creature, who makes the determination of what is best? Because if it's the creature itself, that might be different. That's subjective because it would be by individual creature. And this is with my band-aid of decollectivizing it. If it's collectivized, then you couldn't say, well, they all together decide what's best for them. That's nonsense. That doesn't work. That's not how decisions are made. And if it's you, the philosopher, that's just you projecting what's best onto them based on goals that you have subjectively chosen for that creature, based on your observations of the behavior of that creature, which is what we're calling nature, right? So you have decided what the nature of the creature is based on the behavior that you've observed, and then you've used your right reason to determine which actions produce results in line with the nature of the creature. And then you've declared that to be good. So there's layers of issues here, and the most fundamental one is declaring it good. Nothing in nature says that a creature making decisions in line with its nature is the good. That's Hume right there. That is the guillotine in this entire discussion. Yeah. That is the end of this critique, honestly. Like, we could stop there. I mean, I'm not trying to be like a dick about it, but that's it. So let me reiterate that one more time. The biggest flaw, the most lowest level foundational flaw, is that there's nothing in nature that declares acting in accordance with one's nature is good and acting against one's nature is bad. And that's assuming away all of the subjectiveness in what is something's nature. Individual or collectivistic nature. Like all of these other things that we've talked about, we can just assume for the sake of the argument that all makes sense. There's still nothing in nature that says that it's good or bad. That's just an assertion. And that is it.
We would have, in order for this to work, we would have need to have said that like there's some kind of normative property to a nature. It's not just said, substantiated that there's some kind of normative property for things operating in their nature. Like the apple falling is good. Like that in itself is good, which is a huge claim because as far as I can tell, when I see an apple fall, I don't get any good particles communicating to me that that's a good thing that's happening. So this is, like you said, the lowest level. Hume's guillotine strikes again. And based off of his words about Hume, I don't think he has a very high opinion of him, but that doesn't really matter because the logic is sound.
Strategic Tactics in the comments over on Odyssey highlighted again, are they talking best for the individual creature or the group of creatures? And then he points out self-sacrifice would produce drastically different outcomes to the evaluation of the moral equation of natural law. If you're talking about what's best for the nature of all human species, then self-sacrifice of the individual for the collective would be more easily justified to serve the nature, the right reason of the collective of the human species. Whereas if we're talking about the nature of each individual, then that reclassifies the entire moral discussion. They only talk in terms of the collective men, which I'm trying to be charitable. I don't think that's what they mean. But that's the language they're using. So I'm trying not to burn them with that torch too much. But
we do not judge elephants to be good because they are natural or because nature is morally good. whatever that would mean. We judge a particular elephant to be good by the light of what elephant nature makes it possible for elephants to do and be.
This is Hume. This is Hume right here, peeking his head back up and slicing it again. We judge a particular elephant to be good. This is a subjective judgment you're placing on the elephant based on standards that you've decided. Nothing in nature says that when the elephant does elephant things, that is the good, or that is morally good. Why is the natural good? There's not a way to prevent ourselves from distinguishing between useless and serviceable beasts. But you have to project its nature. Like, you have to project a purpose onto an animal. Like, if you wanted the elephant to be in a carnival and give rides to children, then its ability to do that would be where you would judge it serviceable or useless. This is all based on you applying a purpose, a telos, to the elephant, and that telos would be necessarily extrinsic. You would put it on it. If you're just choosing that, like, if the elephant does elephant things, that is the good. Well, again, we're back to Hume's guillotine. Okay.
I'm really hung up on this useless and serviceable beast part, because to me it's such an interesting way to try to phrase this. Like a Pomeranian, I would consider a Pomeranian pretty useless, but someone who owns a Pomeranian probably has some kind of use for having them, right? Like, you wouldn't take a Pomeranian on a hunting trip. You wouldn't expect it to, like, pull a cart or protect your home, but there must be some sort of use, whether it's like emotional use or whatever it be. So I don't see how this is not in itself in the eye of the beholder. I don't think there's an objective standard that we could say, like, oh, yes, this makes the beast useless, this makes it serviceable. That would have to be substantiated, which it's not.
It has to be based on a goal. You can't make that evaluative judgment without a goal, and the goal isn't written on the DNA of the animal. You have to decide on that goal and project that goal onto it to make that evaluation even make sense. James Freeman in the chat, ladies and gentlemen, says, "It is in my nature to try to sleep with as many women as possible. Being a man whore is good." Well, at least you're serviceable, James.
Yeah, very serviceable. A plant, for example, may be seen to be underdeveloped or stunted in its growth. A bird with an injured wing is quite obviously not able to fly as well as others of the same species. And so it is that thing's nature may be thought of as being not merely that in virtue of which the thing acts or behaves in the way it does, but also as a sort of standard in terms of which we judge whether the thing's action or behavior is all that it might have been or could have been.
This is confirmation that he's collectivizing by species and not thinking in terms of the individual, because the only way you judge a small bird as a stunted bird is to compare it to the average of birds of the species. Now, remember that the species is a subjective line drawn around the genetic soup of living creatures that humans have created, which is another objective line circle drawn around the soup of quantum particles that exist in reality. Like, these are all like, okay, we're going to classify this clump of cells as a bird, and we're going to classify these clumps of cells inside of that classification as birds of a specific species, and then we're going to average all those together and point at one small one and say, oh, that one's stunted. So we're going to point at this one small example of quantum particles in the soup as outside the average. Okay, well, this is all projected onto it by humans and not part of reality. Reality didn't give a shit if a bird is small. What's the difference between a small bird of a species and a genetic mutation that is attempting to try out something new to make the bird more successful? Maybe the stunted bird is actually the best form of the bird of the species because it's got a new adaptation that would make it more successful. Like, you're projecting this stuntedness as a bad trait or as a less bird-like bird of the species onto it.
Tell me if this follows as well, okay? So if we're basing the standard of birdness, the nature of the bird, based on its average capacity of the other birds to fly, are the exceptional birds who fly exceptionally well not also outside of their nature for being beyond the standard? Or are we saying that the exceptional is the standard and all of the other birds aren't making the cut? In which case, why isn't the average considered just as bad as the one with the stunted wing or whatever? There's a lot of implications here that I don't think are as easily brushed aside as it may seem.
Think of like animals over time evolving from water-borne creatures to land-based creatures. Like there's going to be a middle ground in which the creatures are losing their capacity to swim well and gaining a capacity to walk well. So at what point you just want to pick one of those at a point in time and say, well, that's doing a terrible job at its nature of being a waterborne creature, and also a terrible job at its nature of being a landborne creature. It's like, no, it is what it is. There's no judgment in reality about that thing's nature. Like when you collectivize it against other creatures, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The collectivizing against creatures is the weird part here too. Because man has an unchanging and an age-old, genetically determined, anatomical, physiological, and psychological makeup, there is reason to believe that at least some of the values that he recognized as good or bad have been discovered or have emerged as human individuals have lived together for thousands of years in many societies. Is there any reason to suggest that these values, once identified and tested, may not be thought of as essentially fixed and unchanging? For example, the wanton murder of one adult by another for the purely personal amusement of the person committing the murder, once it is recognized as a general wrong, is likely always to be so recognized. That is quite the assertion. It definitely changes. Physiologically, humans are much larger today than they were historically.
Yeah, like I'd be hard pressed to think that if you brought some like straight out of, the line that we drew, human, Homo sapien, and brought them to today, that they would be considered to have the same kind of psychological makeup that we do. That doesn't, I can't imagine that follows in a way that he suggests it.
I mean, there's also the nature-nurture dichotomy. Like genetically, you're going to be predisposed maybe to something, but your environment will radically change the outcome of everything listed here: anatomical, physiological, psychological makeup. Also, even a single person from minute to minute will change in these three categories. I can't imagine trying to argue that man as a collective, not even talking about an individual, has an unchanging makeup.
Also, I think I kind of skimmed over this in my head, but I think it's important to remember how low he set the goalpost. There is some reason to believe that at least some of the values that he recognized as good or bad have been discovered or have emerged as human, blah, blah, blah. That bar is like maybe, possibly, a few could perhaps maybe be right. Like there's nothing concrete. It's an entirely speculative analysis.
Is there any reason to suggest that these values, once identified and tested, may not be thought of as essentially fixed and unchanging? And then he brings up murder as an example. So let's analyze murder as a moral judgment being wrong over the course of human history. This is so blatantly obvious, I can't understand why I'm having to make the rebuttal here. Murder has, people murder people all the time for this reason or that. And the reasons that they murder change constantly. They're constantly in flux throughout history. Witch burning, they didn't think that was murder. And so if we're applying an objective definition of murder, which would be the non-consensual killing, then that has been excused, and the reasons that buttress it have changed throughout history constantly. Name every single atrocity where people thought they were justified in killing others non-consensually, and thought they were not, and in many cases, not only did they think it was acceptable, they thought it was righteous to do those murders. And that judgment has changed throughout history. I don't understand why they would make this argument. I don't get it. I wish he was here to tell me, like, what is happening here? Is there any reason to suggest that these values, once identified and tested, may not be thought of as essentially fixed and unchanging? Yeah. There's a million examples of people being murdered throughout history that were thought to be not only acceptable, but righteous. And the categories of those murders changed constantly. Like if we burned a witch today, we would be condemned and caged, rightfully. How is that essentially fixed and unchanging? It literally changes. These ones bother me because they make me question my own capacities. I'm like, I have to be missing something obvious here because the exceptions are so obvious. What am I missing? but I'm not seeing it. So if you guys know tell me in the comments if I'm missing something, but I'm not seeing it. This just comes off to me as totally irrational.
I had the same kind of feeling the first time I ever read through G.E. Moore's Proof of an External World, when he's like, duh, I have a hand. And I'm like, you literally can't have written this. Like, that can't be your proof for an external world, right? But then, like, you just have to, I think the only way that you can take these, especially with people who can't be here to defend themselves or clarify, is to take the words for what they say on the page, nothing more, nothing less. What it seems to be is a gross generalization, like we've said before, or oversimplification at the least, of how people work and how these things work.
One common philosophic objection to natural law ethics is that it confuses or identifies the realism of fact and value. Furthermore, it identifies evil not with non-existence, but rather with a mode of existence in which natural tendencies are thwarted and deprived of realization.
There's so much there in that one idea. What is the natural tendency from a moral perspective of humanity today? What is the average? What is the aggregate? I don't think we would suggest that it's what's being proposed here. I don't think it would be the rational, the application of right reason in a way that produces good and happiness for these people, the best good for these people in their circumstances. I think it would, so if you're going to make these averages and generalizations and apply them in some circumstances, like say the physiological one with the birds, how can you not also apply that in a normative sense when it comes to humans? Like, would it not be easier to defend that our nature is like the terrible thing that it's being portrayed as, and not this hyper rationalized society of like right reason?
What is it called? Where is it? Localized maximums? It's like if you have a hilly terrain and I put a ball on one of the hills, it'll roll down until it finds a low point. But that low point might not necessarily be the lowest point because there's a local minimum that isn't the actual minimum. When you talk about like, okay, you have a plant that has withering leaves because of lack of light, it could just be in a local minimum. It might not be in an evil state of existence that's unhealthy. It could just be, maybe the leaves that it grew were for the light that was there for that part of the season, and then for the next part of the season, it needs to grow leaves over here. But even like what I'm saying when I say it needs to do that is applying sort of normatively declaring what the plant needs to do to survive, which is a goal that I'm applying to it. So where in nature is it said that that plant is supposed to survive to be good? I mean, we're back to Hume's law there. I try and talk about it on their terms, and then I always spiral back down to Hume. It's like, oh yeah, you're Hume. Blah, 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 Hume.
I need a little mini desk guillotine that I can pull out and so I can clap it.
I need a meme. I need a video meme that just like guillotines the screen. Whooching. The lame man is not non-existent. He exists, but with a natural power partially unrealized. If the man is lame, he doesn't have a natural power. His nature is what it is. It's neither maximal nor minimal. It's just his current power.
So
it's not like he has a spiritual leg there that's just not there anymore, but the ghost of the leg is still there, ready to go. We're getting stuck over and over on the same objections, it feels like. But I mean, naturally, right? Naturally. David Hume is the philosopher supposed by modern philosophers to have effectively demolished the theory of natural law. Hume's demolition was two-pronged. The raising of the alleged fact-value dichotomy, thus debarring the inference of value from fact, and his view, literally 2/3 of the page is a footnote, and his view that reason is and can only be a slave to the passions. Hume, in fact, failed to prove that values cannot be derived from facts. Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm gonna highlight that one. Oh, that's news to me. Wow. It is frequently alleged that nothing can be in the conclusion of an argument which was not in one of the premises, and that therefore an ought conclusion cannot follow from descriptive premises. But a conclusion follows from both premises taken together. The ought need not be present in either one of the premises so long as it has been validly deduced. To say that it cannot be so deduced simply begs the question.
Then do it. Sorry.
Yeah. Show me the proof.
This is a nothing burger rejection. This is a nothing burger rejection. Do it. Simply do it then.
Yeah, show me the logical proof with two premises that establish an ought in the conclusion.
Yeah, the thing that was, so just to make sure everybody's clear on this.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So when he says you can't draw an ought from an is, right, is essentially what he's saying here. That's the common fact value distinction. Nothing can be in the conclusion of the argument that was not in one of the premises. And what is being included in the ought from an is argument is the normative property itself, the good or bad, the ethics of it, you could say. And if there is no normative property in the premise, you can't derive it. You cannot produce it in the conclusion. It's an impossibility. There is no X and Y, therefore Z. You get X and Y. There has to be more to it than that.
I'm trying to come up with what's a good practical example of Hume's guillotine. And the reason why we're harping on Hume is because, as we've said many times, he is the slayer of moral philosophies. It's this distinction that you can't get an ought from an is, you can't get a value from a descriptive statement, that everyone either ignores willfully or isn't aware of for some stupid reason.
Speeding is my favorite.
Go ahead.
Driving fast makes you more likely to crash. Therefore, you ought not speed. That requires an implicit ought that says you ought not crash. Otherwise, the statement doesn't function. It doesn't follow. It doesn't rationally adhere. So that's a perfect example. There's no way you can take the statement speeding increases your likelihood of getting into a crash and therefore derive a normative fact from that. You can't. It's purely descriptive.
You have to have a goal as one of the premises. Like, crashing is bad. If you speed, you're more likely to crash. Therefore, speeding is bad. Like, that's the goal statement in the premises is what's missing. And you can't get to the ought without the goal statement.
There's always an implied ought. In any is to ought bridge, there's always an implied ought.
This is the whole core disagreement right here. Like, if he honestly believes that Hume failed, and that, I mean, maybe I need to read Philippia R. Foote's Virtues and Vices from 1978. Have you read this? I have not.
I have not. It's, from what I heard, it seems to be a continuation of this idea of like a purpose or a nature or an objective or something that is like universal in these instances, and that to want anything else other than it is to be wrong.
It's a teleological break in from what I can see as real, or maybe just an epistemological break. Like, they think they can know or discern a thing's nature. And I
think it's probably a product of inference, honestly. Like, I mean, I think they're saying I think it's based off of flawed inference on top of that, but it seems to be they see all ravens are black, therefore all ravens are black. Like, that's true up until you find a blue raven. And what we've been doing is showing a bunch of blue ravens. So that's the flaw in the inference.
Yeah. And again, pointing out the collectivization of ravens as an arbitrary category of birds. What do you think about Hume's assertion that they mentioned in that last paragraph? Man's reason can only discover the proper ends for man to follow, and that Hume held only the emotions can set man's ends, and that reason's place is as the technician and handmaiden to the emotions. I think that's a predilection, but not a necessity. Like, he states it as a universal fact. I think, like, that might be the default, but I mean, we can certainly elevate. We can choose to follow reason, right?
Well, Hume talks about emotions in like a very particular way where he sees emotion as like not just like sadness or happiness or etc., but like every thought, impulsive or intentional, that isn't like itself a quote unquote reasonable act, right? Or reasonable outcome in itself. Like it wasn't something you process through. It's an inclination of some kind. So bringing this back to anti-subjectivism, we could say it's the arbitrary selection to follow an ethical theory is in itself like an emotive response that you then build reason out of to follow good ethics. So typically I would agree with Hume, but in this circumstance, but it is using emotion in like a very non-colloquial way. It's like a very everything that's not what you would consider reason kind of way.
But I think they recognize that Hume destroyed this philosophy, and so they're butthurt about it, and we're seeing that uncharitableness flow from the butt pains. That's how's that for a philosophical analysis? There's butt pains afoot here. All right,
Goddamn
that was part 2, ladies and gentlemen. We made it.
16 pages in. It only took us 2.5 hours. If then the natural law is discovered by reason from the basic inclination of human nature, absolute, immutable, and universal validity for all times and places. Holy crap. Wow.
Right back to Passio on that one.
Yeah. It follows that the natural law provides an objective set of ethical norms by which to gauge human actions at any time or place. The natural law is, in essence, a profoundly radical ethic. Hold on. Okay, we got to pump the brakes.
We made it one sentence in. Woo!
All humans in all times and all places all follow the same natural ethic and have the same nature. Does this come back to the proposed immutable qualities of man, like physiologically, psychologically? Is that what all this is rooted in? So that has to be where the universality is derived from, right?
Yes. Yep. The immutable universality. Yep. All times and places.
Okay. Well, we already covered that, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but I felt like I couldn't not say like, hold on, we have to talk about this. So
yeah. So at this point, like they've laid the foundation and they're probably going to start to build the building on top of the foundation. And I think I think I'll just plant a flag here. We've already shown the problem with the foundation. It's invalid.
Well, do you want to maybe talk about like how you would go about, I don't know, maybe constructing an ethic that is universalizable in all times and all places across all people? Because we could do the sales pitch real quick. It wouldn't take that long.
Yeah, let's do it. Go for it.
So basically, there is a way by which you can, and I'm going to be skipping over some of this. You can go read it if you want at antisubjectivism.com. But there is a way that you can derive an ethic that is universal, all people, all times, all places. But you have to properly orient yourself in order to make that a reality. And in this case, it's if you don't want to live in the state of nature, then the negation of the state of nature, which is the action of consent, can produce outcomes which universally which have a degree of universality to them, not a degree, a complete universality to them. Meaning that the state of nature is an unchanging amoral existence that relies on might makes right. That is the fundamental characteristic of the state of nature. And the negation of that, consent, must necessarily always be applicable because the state of nature is unchanging. It is always amoral. It is always might makes right. So if that is true, then it necessarily follows that consent being the negation of the state of nature is a universal in the sense of universalizability ethic.
Ta-da!
That's one way you could do it. That's one way you could do it. That's the way I've seen. That's the best way I've seen that you could do it. But this is my least preferred term. But I will say, how about this? I'll do something. They actually thought about universalizability and how that's important to an ethical system. And they tried to include that in their system. That is a lot further than most people get. Which not all
moral philosophies do. Yeah.
Yeah. That is definitely a pro.
Also, and I don't want to be toxic in saying this, but I want to be educational when I say this. Compare and contrast this stream and how we're engaging with this content to the Passio stream. In Passio, our critique was, we need evidence, you have to prove that. And in this stream, we are able to really sink our teeth in more and dive into all the little nuances of the arguments and that are being provided. And we're reading, footnotes that go off into other studies of other ethical premises. There's meat on this bone. It might be a broken bone, but there's meat on it. So I don't say that just to take a shot at Passio. It's just that I got a lot of negative reaction to my conclusion to the Passio stream when I said that this isn't even a science. This isn't even a philosophy. This is story time with Mark Passio, because it didn't contain the meat that is here. It's at least an attempt at philosophy here, right? Would you agree with that, Christian?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, for the sake of maintaining the same tone, I will say that, yes, we still are sometimes saying, like, you need to substantiate that, et cetera, yada, yada. But we're able to engage with it on a level that there was nothing to engage with in the previous marathon stream that we did. Here, there's stuff we can engage with. We can bounce ideas across. We can try to look for where their thought patterns are coming from, instead of just literally like, what is any of this,
What even is this? Yeah. Well, another thing that is important here is that consistently, repeatedly throughout this text, he has counterattacked criticisms proactively of the philosophy. Like he said, people will say this. Well, here's the rebuttal. People might say that. Well, here's the rebuttal. And then he knows that Hume is a problem, and so he took time trying to at least defend against that. He failed completely, I think, but at least he tried, and at least he knew that was a problem to be dealt with.
Personally, I think he should have just said it to their face. That's a joke only people who are in the Passio stream will get. So
Passiotic evidence.
Clone.
Yep.
Passiotic evidence. He just had to say it to their face.
That's right.
Okay. All right. That's enough.
Yeah.